This is Keith Lipscomb from ESPN. Remember that success is a choice. What choice will you make today?
Providing insights to help you grow your business, improve yourself, and add value to those around you. You're listening to the Success is a Choice podcast, where you get a peek into the lives of industry leaders as they share their stories with you.
Welcome to Success is a Choice podcast. I'm your host, Jamy Bechler. And today we're going to flip the script and turn the tables on our guest. Jason Romano is the host and producer of the Sports Spectrum podcast, where he's interviewed such high-profile guests as the Arizona Cardinals running back David Johnson, Chris Broussard, Mark Price, the $1 Million Man Ted DiBiase, Pastor Louis Giglio, John Gordon, and Ernie Johnson, just to name a few. But today, Jason will be in the hot seat answering questions instead of asking them. Before doing the Sports Spectrum podcast, Jason was a producer at ESPN for 17 years. He created content for shows such as Monday Night Football, Sports Center, and Mike and Mike. Jason's brand new book, Live to Forgive, will be coming out in January. Jason, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here. Pleasure to be here with you, Jamie. Thanks.
Thanks, Jason. Now, you've had a long, distinguished career, done a lot. Kind of fill in the gaps. Give us a little bit more background, kind of dive in a little bit deeper. Yeah,
so grew up big sports nut, dreamed of being Howard Cosell as a kid and wanting to broadcast, sports events and sports games, and, grew up in a small town outside of Albany, New York, and upstate New York called Ravenna, and a very small town. So dreams were just what that was. They were dreams. They weren't anything that I thought I could ever reach or get to. And then through high school and college, started to, acclimate myself to the broadcast world, learn as much about broadcasting as possible, and then got out of college and worked in local radio. So I was a producer in local radio and got my hands wet, my experience there, and then got to ESPN in 2000. And for 17 years worked at the worldwide leader in sports and was a producer there, a talent booker, a talent evaluator there, social media strategist. Did as much as I could do from the standpoint of production as you could imagine in my 17 years there. Worked on shows like Mike and Mike and Sports Center, the NFL on ESPN, worked on that for 8 years and helped to build up their social media presence at ESPN. So did a lot of work, met a lot of great people. And but in February of 2017, decided that it was time for something else. And I've had this sort of calling, I believe, on my life for the last couple of years to do more in my faith, do more for the Lord. And so I took the leap and left and took a big pay cut and started over, I guess, in some ways, working now with Sports Spectrum and doing some of my own things, including writing the book that you mentioned.
Well, when you were at ESPN, you crossed paths and worked with Keith Lipscomb, who was on our podcast. He was episode 26.
Yes.
Yeah, so for those of you that haven't listened to that, you might want to go back and check out that episode as well. With your Sports Spectrum podcast, you've had some amazing guests. Who have been some of your favorites, and what kind of stand out to you as you think back on those interviews?
Well, we've been blessed to have so many great guests on the show. And, I remember specifically the first interview we ever did, which was a year ago at this time. We taped it in December of 2016 when I was still working at ESPN, not knowing that I was going to be leaving. It was just I was at a conference and they asked me to do this interview, and I said yes. And it turned out to be the very first interview we did on our podcast, and it was with a guy named Adam Conley from the Miami Marlins. And he told the amazing story, spiritual story that took place in the aftermath of the Jose Fernandez death. He was the pitcher on the Marlins that died during the season in 2016. So I think about that, and I just think about, the impact that interviews like that have had for many people. I don't know unless somebody tells me the type of impact that these podcasts are having, but I have had the wonderful privilege to get feedback from people and to hear from people who've listened to the podcast. And, there's some lives that are being impacted here. And that's such a amazing thing to be a part of, to be quite honest with you, Jamie, because the interviews that we do, when I was a kid, I always wanted to be a guy who did interviews. And then when I got to college, and even after college, when I got into the broadcast world early in my career, I was more of a behind the scenes guy, a producer. And that's what I did for almost 20 years. So when I got this opportunity to host this podcast, I really didn't think I was qualified, and I certainly didn't know how I would do as an interviewer, but I've been encouraged to hear people who've said that they've been enjoying the podcast, that they've really appreciated the questions that I ask, but really even more, it's about the guests. It's about the people we've had on. I think of James Brown from CBS Sports and sitting down in a room with him for an hour back in May and taping this powerful interview about his career, and I think of a few of the people that we've had on, like a girl named Katie Lentz, who you would never have heard of. You may know she's not like a famous person or has a giant platform, but her story is the most incredible story I've ever heard of how she survived and how God kind of sustained her and helped her through an awful, awful accident that physically just left her mangled in many ways. So hearing these stories of these sort of famous people are really wonderful, and kind of getting behind the curtain to a more deeper look at their life. But it's the people who you may never have heard of that those are the ones that really inspire me the most, because they're not anybody who's famous. They're not anybody who has this giant platform. They're just people who are living life and have gone through some things that and know that their story can help others. And that's really been the whole model of what I want to do as in this post-ESPN career. Is I just want to give people an opportunity to tell their story, and for myself to tell my story, and knowing that stories can impact people, whether you have a giant platform or a small platform. We all have a platform, and it just allows us to tell these stories because it can help other people. And if we have a story and we choose not to tell it because we're embarrassed by it or we're ashamed by it, but we know it can help someone else, then we're being selfish. And so I really believe in the power of story, and that's part of the reason why I'm so grateful to do the podcast that I do.
Your guests on that podcast have certainly have great stories to tell. They've also been fairly successful in some way in their careers. Have you found that when you're talking to them that you kind of find a common habit or a trait that they all share, or many of them share?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, certainly every one of the guests that we've had on have a faith in Christ. So I think that the faith aspect of it is the common ground. That's the obvious one, right? Because it's a podcast on sports and faith. But I think a lot of them all have this personal connection and this personal story or experience that is valuable for people to hear. And I think that's the common ground. I mean, you could go, really general in the common ground of just saying that they all, spiritually are growing in God or whatever you want to say. But I think they all realize that, if I'm asking them to be on, that there's a story to tell. And I ask a question that's the same for every guest at the end of the podcast about what are they learning spiritually? What are they learning from God? And I love asking that because the answers are so wide and vary in the way that they respond. But it's been really, cool to kind of ask the same question on every podcast. I don't like doing that. I like trying to have each podcast be its own, but I do like ending it with the same question and hearing the different responses.
Well, in the introduction, I mentioned a couple of your guests that you've had, and that might be one of the few times that Ted DiBiase and Louis Giglio have been mentioned in the same sentence.
Isn't that true? I mean, that's what's so great about a podcast and so great about, I guess, what we do, because there really isn't another podcast like it out there. There's a couple, but the niche in what we do, it's literally sports spectrum. It's spectrum of sports. So it could be a pastor or it could be a former WWE wrestler. So it's really been wonderful to kind of just open up the gamut of possibilities of people to talk to. And, we got a lot more coming that are, again, all over the place as far as pastors go, as far as athletes, as far as different people in ministries and in nonprofits. So it's been a blast.
You worked at the worldwide leader, ESPN. What are some of the lessons or experiences that you went through there that have kind of shaped how you've done Sports Spectrum, or just some things you'd like to share?
Yeah, there's so many. Like, you could go year by year and I could tell you what I learned experience-wise or lesson-wise. But certainly the best thing to do, and even it says this in the Bible too about, doing what you do, doing it with greatness, and doing the best that you can. I have a a little sort of paperweight right on my desk here, and it says, every job is a self-portrait of the person who did it. Autograph your work with excellence. So I think you really learn when you're at ESPN that the people you work with are the best of the best. So you have to do your work with excellence. And when you don't, you stand out, and you stand out like a really sore thumb. So I think it's important to remember, and I try to do that with Sports Spectrum. It may not be as big a platform. It certainly probably will never be as big a platform as ESPN is in terms of the hundreds of millions of people that they reach every day. But I'm still doing my work in the same way that I tried to do it at ESPN. And that's the best I can do it with, and try to be as good as I can and take the experiences and the knowledge that I have and bring it here to Sports Spectrum. And even in my own world, in the book that I recently wrote, I had a guy help me because I knew that my book, if I wrote it, it would be good. In terms of my writing, I think I'm a good writer, but this guy is an excellent writer. So he helped me craft it and sort of make this book go from good to excellent as far as reading is concerned. Because I want the stuff that I have my prints on to be excellent. So that's really the biggest lesson I learned. And I've learned lessons when I haven't done my work with excellence, and you got to kind of walk through that fire a little bit as well. And but those are the best lessons, I think, when we don't have it all figured out and when we mess up a little bit, and then we can turn it around and take that and learn from that. So, but definitely, I think the best part is to be excellent at everything that you do. If you're the lowest of the low at ESPN and you're a cafeteria worker or a security person, or if you're working in production and you're just doing teleprompter and you're like, man, this is not what I signed up for. Well, if you want to get promoted or move to the next level, you better be the best person working the teleprompter that there is. And that's my kind of advice I always tell young people, because they all want to kind of move up the ladder quickly. And I'm like, well, are you the best at the little one small job that you're being asked to do? Because if you're not, then it's going to be hard to consider you for the next job. So excellence is definitely my number one lesson I've learned.
Your book, Live to Forgive, it'll be officially released on January 15th, I believe, but it's now available for pre-order up till then.
Yes.
What was the genesis of the book? Why'd you decide to write it?
Jamie, if you'd asked me a year and a half ago the same question, I would have laughed in your face, because I would have said, there's no way I'll ever write a book. That's not in my cards. That's not something I ever wanted to do or dream of. And when I say dream of, I really mean that. Like, there's never been a dream in my life that said, I really want to write a book someday. Not the case. But I always say God has bigger plans than we do. And when we make our own plans, he just laughs at us, because this was one of those cases where, I had a story, and I certainly kept it to myself for many years about the relationship with my dad. I grew up with a sports-loving dad. And when I say sports-loving, I mean, this guy lives, eats, and breathes sports. So I get that from him. But he was also an alcoholic and a very abusive, verbally abusive father who was absent, divorced my mom when I was 6 years old. So I never really saw him in the light of a person, the way a person should see their father. So I had this story, and I finally shared it for the first time in a blog post in 2014 that I wrote, and then at a sermon that I preached at a church in 2015. And from there, I just started seeing people telling me too, your story is important. You need to keep sharing it. And I never understood why people were saying that, but I do now. And somewhere along the lines, about a year and a half ago, I come across a pastor from California, and he and I are connecting, and we're having a conversation. And he says to me, you need to write a book. And I just laughed at him, like I would have laughed at you if you said that. And he said, no, you need to write a book, and you need to tell your story of forgiveness and your dad. You just need to, because I heard your sermon, and this is too important for people not to hear. And I just kind of chuckled a little bit, and I'm like, well, I don't even know how to go about doing that. And he said, well, just start writing, and then, start with a chapter or two. I'll introduce you to my literary agent, and they can tell you sort of how the book process works. So in a span of 3 or 4 months, I went from this first discussion with this pastor to signing a book contract with a company called, a publisher called Core Media out of Charlotte, North Carolina. And the next thing you know, we're writing a book about forgiveness, and it's based around the story of my relationship with my dad, a broken relationship for just about 40 years until the time when I was finally able to forgive him for the mess that he had made of himself and of our family. And that's where the idea of the book came from. The title is called Live to Forgive because I really believe when we forgive in our lives, and this is not some special spiritual Christian thing. I think this is just a universal trait for people to know, whether they're, spiritual or religious or not, is that when we forgive, it truly leads to freedom. And so many of us hold this bitterness, this anger, this sort of wrath upon other people who've hurt us. And man, I know a lot of people who've been so hurt in ways even worse than I could probably ever imagined. But I've also seen from these same people, and including myself, there's a freedom in forgiveness. And the freedom comes from ourselves. We're not letting the other person off the hook when we forgive. We're just freeing ourselves from bitterness. It's like being stuck in chains. And when we don't forgive, we're just kind of keeping these chains wrapped around us. And when we choose to forgive, it actually frees us. It doesn't let the other person off the hook. And that's the idea of where the book came from and why I wrote it. And I just hope it impacts some people. If it can help one person in their journey towards forgiveness and their healing towards a broken relationship of some sort, then it was worth it. So that's why I'm writing it.
Now, Darryl Strawberry, the great baseball player, he wrote the foreword for your book. How did you go about selecting him?
Well, I say selecting. It's funny that you say it like that because Darryl and I, in my time at ESPN, I've been very lucky and blessed to meet tons of athletes and tons of influencers in the athletic world and even outside of the athletic world. And Darryl Strawberry was my childhood hero. So if you went back and talked to 10-year-old Jason, you would have seen posters in his room of Darryl Strawberry. You would have seen Darryl Strawberry shirts, a Mets hat, and you would have seen a notebook that kept stats of every game that Darryl Strawberry played. So this is kind of the idea of who this guy was for me as a kid. He was my sports hero. In 2009, Darryl Strawberry came to ESPN, and I got to spend the day with him and show him around and help promote his book that he had written at that time and just released. And we just got to know each other on a pretty deep level because of the relationship with my dad that I had, which at the time was very broken, and sort of the world that he lived in, coming from alcohol and drugs and just being stuck in addiction. And we just had this connection. I don't know why. We didn't talk about the Mets. We didn't talk about, the 86 team that won the World Series. We didn't talk about baseball at all, which is probably what I would have liked to talk about instead of talking about the mess that was the relationship with my father. But we spent 8 hours together and just connected and stayed in touch. And as I was putting together the book, and I really thought for a while, I thought from the very moment we started writing this, who's going to write the foreword? And I had some ideas of some people, not named Darryl Strawberry, to be honest with you. And then Darryl kind of came back into my life back in March this year when I went and saw him at a conference in Hartford, Connecticut that he spoke at, a Christian men's conference. And I went over to him. I kind of reintroduced myself, but he stopped right away. He's like, Jace, of course I know who you are. I remember you. And the first thing he said to me was, how is your dad? And that's always what he used to say to me before, but he really said this time, he said, how is your dad? He remembered that. And I told him, I said, I have good news, Darryl, because I hadn't talked to him in about 4 years. I said, my dad is sober and has been for 4.5 years, and I'm writing a book about our relationship and about forgiveness. And I think he was just so excited about that he gave me his card, gave me his number again, even though I already had it. We reconnected and we stayed in touch over the next 3-4 months and just kept texting each other, encouraging each other. And he's a traveling evangelist now. So he's doing some really great things, impacting a lot of lives. And when it came time to we were down in like August of 2017 and trying to figure out who's going to really write this. And I had a backup plan of somebody that I knew would do it. I hadn't asked them yet. I'm not going to say who it is because that would make that person feel bad or whatever potentially. But when Darryl and I kind of reconnected, I asked him, I said, would you consider writing something for my book? He's like, anything you need. And originally it was just to get an endorsement, but he said he would write the foreword, and that's kind of where it came from. And man, I'll tell you, to have his name on the cover of a book with my name that's beyond anything I could ever have dreamed of.
I hope that you are enjoying this interview with Jason Romano. He's had some big-time guests on his Sports Spectrum podcast who have also written books such as Ernie Johnson and John Gordon, to name just a few. Our friends at Audible are now offering our listeners a free audiobook download so you can get a copy of one of these books or any other book from a library of more than 180,000 titles. Just go to audibletrial.com/Success is a Choice podcast to get this free download as well as a free trial membership. That special deal, once again, can be found at audibletrial.com/Success is a Choice podcast. And now back to our interview with Jason Romano. Now, this is the topic of this with forgiveness, but the specific topic that you're talking about is pretty deep. It's definitely strained relationship with a parent, which is a pretty tough one to handle. For somebody that maybe hasn't gone through something quite that tough. We all seem to have problems with forgiveness, or we all seem to have those people in our life that hurt us in some way. Maybe they haven't gone through as deep of an issue as you had to deal with. Is this book still for them, and what would be your advice for those people?
Yes, it's the advice is the book is, in my opinion, the book is for anyone who has struggled with forgiveness. And, I could say something to the effect of just a relationship with a coworker or a boss, and you felt like they did you wrong, and you have this bitterness towards them. Is that as deep and impactful as a broken relationship with a parent? Probably not, but it's still one of those things that people probably have stuck, in the back of their brain. They still can't stand this person, or in many ways, they hate the person or whatever for doing them wrong. So I think this book is for anybody that struggles with forgiveness. There is a level of sort of depth in the book that takes it deeper for some, for myself than maybe for some others. But I do that intentionally because I want people to see sort of the raw, real feelings and emotions that I had. Writing this book was very therapeutic in a lot of ways because there were emotions that I have forgotten, or memories, or even roots of bitterness that I had forgotten I still had that were there and kind of tucked away, in one of the chapters we call it boxes in the attic. And there's a reason for that, because it literally felt like this bitterness that I thought was completely gone, and I'm pretty sure it had been, but there were still some things rooted in these boxes and that I had put up in my attic and thinking I stored away and wouldn't even have to open up again. So I think this book is for really any person that has ever struggled with forgiveness in one way or the other, which in a lot of ways is all of us. Right?
Yeah. So your audience is everybody.
It really is. I mean, listen, it's going to probably be more impactful towards, a man who has struggled in a relationship with their dad, of course, or even a female who might struggle with a relationship with their dad or their mom, or, something to that effect. So I think it's going to be maybe a little bit more profound and impactful for certain people because of specific experiences in their lives. But I think every person can read it and get something out of it as far as understanding the freedom that does come with forgiving someone for the wrong that they've caused to you.
Or even to take it from a sports standpoint.
Yeah.
How many kids out there or parents out there, have issues with a coach? The coach screwed them out of playing time, and so they didn't get a scholarship or something like that. And that might seem like a small issue, but those can develop habits of not forgiving people and having bitterness and not being, like you say, free. And then one day they have kids of their own, or they have wives, or they have, coworkers, and they have developed habits of not forgiving people.
That's exactly right. And I think, like I say, it's really for everybody, but coaches there's a lot of sports in this book for obvious reasons with the relationship with my dad. And the one thing that connected myself with my father was sports. And that's the one thing that should have brought us together and really ended up tearing us apart. But yeah, from a coaching perspective, I know there's a lot of people who felt like their coaches did them wrong or they didn't get a shot. I had a coach in high school who wouldn't play me my senior year of high school, and I was so mad at him. And then I ended up playing in community college basketball. And I remember wanting to go back to him and just say, see, you messed up, and kind of got to get back at him, even at 17, 18, 19 years old, just kind of get revenge on him. And so, yeah, there's a lot of lessons to learn, I think, in that revenge really doesn't do anybody any good, especially when you're trying to work towards forgiveness. Vengeance isn't really the answer. Forgiveness is the answer.
Well, and even if you think about it logically, the other person's probably not losing sleep at night, and they're probably not getting ulcers thinking
right.
about what they did to you. And in some respects, some of these cases, they may not even know that they did something that you were offended by, but
yes.
you're getting torn up about it all the time.
Exactly. And that's why I believe fully that when we forgive, we're doing it not to let the other person off the hook. We're doing it for ourselves because in many cases, the other person doesn't even know the damage that they did or caused. Honestly, Jamie, with my book, my dad hasn't read it yet. And he knows that there's a book coming, and we've been talking a lot about it, but he has not read this book. And there's a little bit inside of me that's a little concerned about this. Not concerned, I guess isn't the right word, but I don't really think he understood truly the depths of the bitterness that I had towards him. And he's going to see it when he reads the book. But he was the first person to give me the endorsement and say, please write this. If it can help other people, please do. But I'm really not concerned, I guess isn't the right word, but interested, I guess, is the better word, to see what he thinks when he reads this, because it's a lot of ways it paints him in a very negative light for many chapters of the book. But yeah, sometimes I don't think people understand what the wrong that they've done until somebody has to tell them. And then I think the reason you tell them is to free yourself. And I think that's why forgiveness is much better than vengeance. I really do.
Well, and Buddha used to say, or he has a quote attributed to him that says, not forgiving someone is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die.
Yes, we talk about that. It's literally like drinking poison and thinking the other person's going to die from it. No, it's not how it works. It's a great quote.
Well, turning our attention to a little lighter part, you have a podcast, you've had great guests, but do you have a bucket list? Do you have a couple guests that are like the people that you absolutely would want to have on?
I do. In fact, I'm looking at it right now. It's on my whiteboard above my desk where my laptop is. I have a schedule of the guests that are coming up on the podcast. And then I have some tapings that I have, and then I have literally a segment area that says bucket list. And so I'll read you the names because these are the people that I want to have on. So I have Tim Tebow listed on there. I think Tim would be amazing because obviously his faith is strong, but I think his journey has been pretty incredible to watch him, and the way that people respond to him, and sort of the cult figure that this guy has become. He's so big. I would love to kind of try and dive deeper inside of that and how he has dealt with that. I wrote Steph Curry on there because I think Steph is another guy who I know his faith is important to him, but he is super human on the basketball court, and his fame has obviously grown a lot too. But he came from a basketball family, and his dad played in the NBA and was one of the best shooters of all time. So I really love to talk to Steph. Clayton Kershaw is a guy in baseball that I think would be a really interesting story to talk to about him and sort of his fame and his heart for helping others. And I have two guys on here that I think we're going to actually be able to do an interview with soon at a conference that they're going to be at and I'm going to be at. But Carson Wentz from the Eagles and Kirk Cousins from the Redskins. Both those guys are very strong in their faith and really put God first in their lives and have had great success in the NFL as quarterbacks, especially early on here for Carson. But neither of them are unashamed about their faith. So I really want to talk to them about that and kind of getting inside their brains about why they play football and understanding, I think, that the platform that they've been given is not just to play football, but to impact lives. So that's kind of the bucket list I have. I think I could go outside of the sports world and come up with a bunch of other names as well. But in the sports world, those are the primary people I would love to talk to on the podcast.
When you are not doing your podcast, are there podcasts yourself that you like to listen to or books you like to read?
For sure. There's plenty of them. I think that's part of the whole process of learning. As I've gotten older, I used to hate reading when I was a kid. I used to hate being told, because to continue to learn. I only wanted to read sports. I didn't want to read about life and people and just things going on. And now I think in my 40s, I've become more of a learner than I ever have been. And so I listen to a ton of podcasts. The ones that stick out, I think, are Bill Simmons, who has been doing a podcast for ESPN first and now for his own company. But I've been listening to Bill do his podcast for 9 years or so. It's probably the first podcast I ever listened to. And I just love the platform, the long-form platform of being able to talk for, half hour, listening, going off on different tangents to discuss topics, but then the interviews that he's been doing and the people that he's been able to get just feel like you're at a sports bar in a man cave just having a conversation about sports. So I've always loved Bill. And there's a couple other podcasts that I listen to. I listen to a lot of leadership podcasts. I listen to a lot of sort of they're kind of news podcasts on stories, like people that have disappeared, murder stories, people that have had bad things happen to them. I think just to kind of understand, not the story itself and try to get myself into that world, but just listening. I listen with a different ear now, because when you produce and host your own podcast, I listen trying to hear how they do their podcast. How do they produce it? How do they host it? How do they put the pieces together to put their story together? So I like that a lot. And I listen to a couple of other podcasts that are more along the lines of what I do, including Brock Heward, the former NFL quarterback, college football analyst now, does a program called Above and Beyond, which is similar to the one I do, sports and faith, and has, stories of guys and kind of gets inside their story a little bit more deeper and kind of understanding from a personal level, a spiritual level. So I really enjoy Brock's interviewing. And then I'm consulting with a guy right now who is hosting a podcast called the Rich Take on Sports podcast. And Richmond Weaver is the host, and it's not taken off yet as far as a ton of downloads, but it's a really good listen from a guy who is brand new in this whole interviewing thing. And we've been doing this together for about 6 months, and Rich is really talented and has a good sort of depth on how he can ask his questions, but also on the interviews that he gets. He's got some really big names on his podcast and in a very short time, and it's not because of working with me. Like, these are interviews that he's gotten on his own, and that's been really nice to see. He had Dabo Sweeney on from Clemson recently and talked with him for 25 minutes, and it was awesome. So these are the kind of podcasts I listen to. There's tons. I mean, I could just keep going on, Jamie, because I really do listen to a lot of them. But these are the ones that kind of stand out. And then you mentioned books. I mean, I could read a ton of books, or mention a ton of books, but the ones that have had the most influence on me are these sort of leadership books told through fables. Very recently, I've been reading a lot of John Gordon's books, especially The Carpenter, which is one of John Gordon's best books and probably the most impactful book in my life. Todd Gongwer has a book called Lead for God's Sake, which is, again, a fable, sort of leadership told through the lens of a story that he wrote about a coach and a janitor, and just awesome. I mean, really just impactful for my life, changed my life in a lot of ways 6 years ago when I first read it. And then I read a lot of obviously I read a lot of spiritual books and a lot of faith-based books in the Bible. But Tim Ferriss's books have been impactful recently, not really from a spiritual perspective, it's just from a leadership perspective, from a guy who's left ESPN and worked there for so many years and now is working kind of on his own and doing his own thing. And Tim Ferriss, his stuff has been really, really good. His Tools of the Titans book was awesome, and just kind of getting inside the minds of leaders in other areas of the world. And it helps expand my horizons too, because when you live in a sports bubble, you literally could get stuck in that bubble. And I've been trying to really be intentional about getting out of that bubble for the last maybe 3 years or so. So that's a lot to ask. I know that's a long answer, but there's a lot I could have added to that too.
No, that's great. And we'll be sure to put all those in the show notes so our listeners can check those out. Jason, where can people connect with you or learn more about you or your book or the podcast?
Yeah, I mean, I'm on social media, and you can find me there pretty easily if you just search my name. I'm at Jason Romano on Twitter and Instagram. And then Facebook, you just search my name or put in Jason Romano 22, and you'll find my Facebook page. I also updated my website recently, so I think if you just want to go there, you can find out more about the book. You can order the book from my website. You can reach me if you're interested in any speaking engagements or contacting me for anything like that. And then I have a blog on there as well of some of the blogs that I've written over the past, 3-4 years, I guess. So that's just jasonromano.com, jasonromano.com.
Great. We'll put those in the show notes. So Tim Tebow, make sure you check out that show note so you can know where to connect with Jason Romano to get.
Come on, Tim. We used to be colleagues at ESPN. Come on the podcast, man.
Yeah. Why are you being like that? Why?
Come on, Tim.
Just go on. Come on. You'll make his day. You'll make him smile. But Jason, really appreciate you being on the show today. I know you're busy, so thanks a lot for joining us.
Jamie, thanks for having me, buddy. I appreciate it. Wish you nothing but the best with your podcast, and grateful for you. So thanks for having me.
I really appreciate Jason stopping by today. You will definitely want to check out his website at jasonromano.com and pre-order his book. You'll also want to subscribe to the Sports Spectrum podcast. He has a great guest list from the world of sports. And while you're at it, if you haven't yet done so, please subscribe to our podcast so that you don't miss any future episodes. Thanks so much. And until next time, remember that success is a choice. What choice will you make today?